Somebody earlier was asking if spending 200 bucks on a Hitbox was worth it. I get this question a lot. They say, hey, I'm thinking about learning a fight stick. Is it worth it? Or, hey, I'm thinking about switching from stick to Hitbox. Is it worth it? And my answer is it depends on what the reason you want to switch is. So this thing is great, right? Hitbox is dope. And a lot of people talk about Hitboxes and how cool they are and how they can help your execution and how while you're using one, you know, your inputs are going to be super clean and all that kind of shit. And when you're deciding if you want to go from stick to Hitbox or pad to Hitbox or pad to stick or whatever you want to do, you have to figure out why you want to do it. Because one thing I'll tell you is that your execution is not going to magically improve by switching. Most of the techniques that you have to do in fighting games are sometimes harder or a little easier on certain input devices, but in general, each device has their own things that are easier or harder on them, and it all kind of works out depending on what you play. On a Hitbox, for instance, I think that charge moves in Street Fighter or something is easier. I think that a lot of the inputs in Tekken, like, you know, electrics or anything with a neutral input is easier on this thing. But I also think for my personal use, I think that mashing uppercuts on defense is a little harder on Hitbox. And I think that half circles are a little weird for me to do on this thing. Now, like any device, I could just practice on this and I'll figure out how to do it eventually. And it's the same thing. If you play on pad and you think electrics are hard, if you just practice, eventually, you know, you'll be better at hitting electrics. Or if you play on stick and you think that, I don't know, instant air dashing is hard, if you just keep practicing on stick, you'll get it down. You'll get better at it. And if you switch devices, is there a chance that certain inputs that you struggle with could be easier? Sure, but there's also a transition time from learning one device to the other, so you have to remember that. The biggest thing that I think happens to people is they buy something like a Hitbox, they go and they play their friends, and their friends who they usually beat, they start getting beat up by when they're playing on Hitbox, and they say, if I was playing on pad or if I was playing on stick, I'd beat you up. So they switch away from the Hitbox. And then you do that, you'll never fully commit to learning a new device. If you want to be a Hitbox player, if you want to go from pad to stick, or if you want to do whatever, you just got to commit and play on whatever you want to play on. And at the end of the day, it's about what's convenient to you and what, you know, feels right to you. If you've never played a fighting game before and you're familiar with PC games, I'd probably recommend this just because I think this is closer to what like a keyboard is like. And this is probably like personally fine. In this day and age, you don't really need an arcade stick. People play on arcade stick because back in the day, you had to play on arcade stick on arcade cabinets and people were just used to it. I can play on pad, I can play on stick, I can play on Hitbox. I think all of them have their own strengths and weaknesses and advantages and disadvantages. But at the end of the day, people compete at the highest level on all three devices, and no matter what you use, you know, it's going to take you time and effort put into execution to be comfortable. So that's how it works. Just give it some time. You'll be all right.